A guy once spoke about a clock that sat on his grandmother's mantle. It wasn't fancy, but I don't know if the mechanism was old and made out of quality materials, but it was very loud. You could hear it ticking. And he said every tick, had meaning for his grandmother. She used to say that sound is the heartbeat of your life. And you don't know how many beats you have left, how many ticks are left in your clock, right? He said as a child, he thought it was morbid, but as he got older, he realized that it was wisdom. We don't like to think about time running out, do we? I mean, none of us like to think about that. It sounds kind of morbid to us when we do. But then, things happen during the year. Maybe we have a birthday, or maybe September comes and the school year starts and church activities kind of get ramped back up. And, we feel the rush of time again after summer. Going by. Another season has passed, and whether we like it or not, that clock, it keeps ticking, doesn't it? It just keeps on ticking over and over again. And there's a psalm in the Bible that speaks right into this feeling. It's Psalm 90. And Moses reflects on the brevity of life, and he prays, "Teach us to number our days, so that we will have a heart of wisdom." That's a prayer I think we need too in our lives, not just to count the hours, but to live them well. Not just to feel the passage of time, but to be wise with it. All of us need to get a heart of wisdom. If you have your Bible, we're going to read part of Psalm 90. I'll start in verse 12. "So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and as for many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us." Yes, establish the work of our hands. We've been studying the Psalms on Wednesday nights. Some of you may not know we have church on Wednesday nights, but we do. And have a Bible study. We've been looking at some of the Psalms, but this one's kind of outside of the scope of what we've been studying, but it is a very interesting psalm. It's the only one in the Bible that's attributed to Moses. So that may make it the oldest prayer in the Psalms. It was likely written during Israel's wilderness wanderings, when an entire generation was fading away under God's judgment. And that experience, I think, kind of gives the psalm its tone when you read through it. God is eternal and unchanging, from everlasting to everlasting, but human life is brief and it's fragile. You see these two contrasts going on in the psalm, and that contrast is sharp. 1,000 years to God are like a day, while our lives are compared to things that are brief. It's like grass that withers, or like a dream that vanishes. And against this backdrop, Moses prays to God that we would use our days well. He asked God to use his days well. And the psalm moves from frailty to faith, from the reality of death to the hope that God will satisfy and establish and even redeem the work of his people. So get a heart of wisdom. Number one, life is brief, so count wisely. Life is brief, so count wisely. Moses begins the psalm by anchoring us in God's eternal nature, right, as the creator, the sustainer, the immortal Lord of the heavens and earth. Look at verses 1 and 2. "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." So against that eternal backdrop, our lives look different, don't they? We're not from everlasting to everlasting. We weren't there when the mountains were raised up. And then look at verse 4. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. 1,000 years, well, that's nothing from the Lord's point of view, but it's a long time for us, isn't it? Our years, even if they reach 70 or 80 or maybe even 90, right, they quickly slip away and they fly off, right? He pictures us like grass that flourishes in the morning but withers by nightfall, fresh and strong for a moment and then gone. And then he prays in verse 12, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. You know, this phrase, to number, it means to weigh carefully, to measure accurately. You ever been to the doctor's office and they keep tinkering with that scale to make sure they get every last pound on there? You know what I'm talking about? They're weighing accurately. You want to make sure. And I'm like, well, let me take my watch off and let me take this off. And oh, I've still got my wallet here. You know, we play this little game back and forth, and eventually, you know, you get weighed correctly and measured accurately. Well, that's kind of what this word means here. We need to recognize the limits of our life. It's not enough to know that life is short. I think most of us, you know, kind of understand that intuitively. But we must let that truth shape the way we live. If life is short, if life is brief, then we should count wisely. We should measure our days carefully. You know, we should put some effort into it. And I think we resist this truth. You know, we go through our days as though they're endless. We plan as though we have all the days in the world. We fill up our days with noise, distractions, busyness. We scroll, we drift, we delay. We don't count our days wisely. We're not measuring them or weighing them carefully, right? So how do we count wisely? Well, we count wisely when we let God set the value of our days. You know, numbering our days doesn't mean we're living in fear of life ending too soon or anything like that, but it does mean living with direction in the present. It means having the right trajectory. It means asking, how will I use this day? What will I pour myself into that's going to matter when time runs out? What am I doing that matters to God and His kingdom? You know, every day we have under the sun, well, that's a gift from our Creator, our Maker. And every day is an opportunity for us to invest in things that last forever. Life is brief, so we should count wisely. There was a teacher who once handed each of her students a jar that was filled with 180 marbles, one for each instructional day of the school year. Each morning, they were supposed to remove a marble from the jar. And over the course of the year, the jars would kind of go down, right? And this exercise wasn't meant to depress them. Of course, I'm sure it did at the start of the year. You got all these days to suffer through. But instead, it was to remind them, how will I use this day? What will I pour myself into? You know, what am I going to do? It was meant to sharpen them. Every marble should be say, well, today, you know, this is today. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to get the most out of it, right? And Moses is kind of giving us the same challenge here in Psalm 90. He says, count your days, measure them carefully, treat them as precious because they're limited. We have brief days under the sun. Don't waste them, because when one of those marbles is gone, it never returns. And you know what I'm talking about? As you get older, we tend to lose those marbles, don't we? So get a heart of wisdom, right? Life is brief, so count wisely. And if you want to get a heart of wisdom, not only should you count wisely, but you need to remember a life is God's, so you should live intentionally. Life is God's, you should live intentionally. This is really just another way of saying the first point. Psalm 90 doesn't end in despair. After facing the brevity of life and how brief things are, Moses lifts his eyes to God in prayer. Look at verse 14. He cries out, "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days." Do you see that? Notice the shift. If the first part of the psalm tells us how fragile, how fleeting life is under the sun, well, then this section is showing us something different. It shows us that life gains meaning when it's rooted in God's steadfast love, right? King James translates this word steadfast love as loving kindness. So you've probably seen it before. It's the Hebrew word that means covenant love. It describes God's relationship that he has with people who are in a covenant with him, right? It's God's covenant loyalty, his unbreakable grace and his mercy. It's his faithful commitment to his people. So Moses asked not merely for long life or for easy days, which is probably what most of us would ask for, but instead he asked God himself to fill his days with joy. Only then, when we're living them in God's love, in his direction, in his favor, can our lives truly be abundant. Now the prayer continues in verse 17. He says, "Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands." Yes, establish the work of our hands. And so here Moses is admitting what all of us know: life is temporary, isn't it? It's fragile. It's easily forgotten. I mean, what have you done in the last year that's going to be remembered 100 years from now? We all know that. Life is very fragile, easily forgotten. We build, we strive, and yet whether or not we're making eternal investments, that's something else, right? Time has a tendency of wearing down what we create. Yet Moses dares to ask God for something extraordinary in this psalm. He says, "Give permanence to the work of my mortal hands. Establish it. Let it last. Let me have a legacy. Let me do something that endures long after I'm gone." You know, in other words, when our short lives are placed into God's eternal purposes, right, when we're living out his loving kindness, then what we do, our labor, tends to take on an eternal kind of weight. What is done for the Lord, what is done in him, that's not wasted. It's never wasted. And this is kind of at the heart of intentional living, right? Days that are surrendered to God, work that is entrusted to his hands, and the joy we receive in return from his steadfast love. Because we're counting wisely and we're living intentionally. We're walking in God's favor. Every September, when life kind of resets after the summer, we have a choice. Will this be another season filled with hurried busyness as we run around and do everything, you know, we've got to do? Maybe you got kids or grandkids in school, and the older they get, the busier you get. Anybody notice that? That's kind of how it goes. I mean, are we going to just be busy? Or will this be a season that we live intentionally for the Lord? And living intentionally, well, then that means asking some, I think, important questions. Not just, what do I need to get done today? It goes beyond that. The questions are more important. Instead, we might ask, what matters to God today? What matters to him? Not just how much can I achieve, but how faithful can I be in the work he's entrusted to me? Am I doing what God wants me to do? It means reordering our calendars around His priorities. It means giving time to prayer before rushing to our emails. It means reading His Word before doom scrolling social media on our phones, right? It may mean teaching children and grandchildren the truths of Scripture, visiting someone in need, serving God with some ordinary task. Maybe it's seeing the regular tasks you have at work and home as offerings to the Lord, right? These are investments that can last. The truth is, most of what we're chasing in our lives, it's going to fade away and be gone not long after we are gone. But what we consecrate to God, what we give over to Him, what we dedicate to Him, our prayers, our service, our love, our witness, those are things that God establishes forever. Forever. About 10 years ago, a man bought a few acres along a river and decided he wanted a small pecan orchard. He'd gotten to that place in life where he thought pecans tasted good. I've got a philosophy about pecans, that how as human beings our tastes change as we get older. When I was a small child, my grandparents loved pecans and would try to get me to eat them. I thought they tasted like kitty litter. It was disgusting. And then in my 20s, I realized, well, they're not just terrible, but I didn't like them. Somewhere around 40, I'm like, well, I can eat them. And now at 50, I kind of like them. And I think it just gets worse as you get older. We have a pecan tree over in that parking lot, and I hadn't lived in Yukon very long. And it's a very cold day in late fall. I think there's snow on the ground. And there were 3 people in their late 80s crawling around the parking lot over there. And my oldest son said, Dad, what are they doing? And I said, son, they're getting pecans. It's like crack when you get over 80. That's kind of my personal theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but this guy had reached that point where he kind of liked some pecans. And he did what anybody would do. He watched a couple of videos. He found a good place for it. He looked around for what type of pecan tree he wanted to go. He got a good price. And he put in 2 very clean, tidy rows of the same variety of pecan, and they look beautiful. And for 8 years, he worked that orchard faithfully, and the trees grew, and they got bigger and bigger, and they looked really pretty, and you could walk between them, and they were perfectly spaced. He would water them, he'd fertilize them, he would prune, he would mow around them, give them food. He'd go through with his hoe and just work on anything that was growing that he thought might disrupt these pecan trees. But the trees were beautiful, and they were leafy and healthy. But when harvest came every year, there were almost no pecans. Year after year, the same disappointment. Imagine the frustration, right? You know, when you're willing to get down on your hands and knees and get pecans, and you're not getting any. Imagine how frustrated he was. Nearly a decade of sweat and nothing to show for it. Nothing to show for it at all. Finally, in discouragement, when he had absolutely no other options, he got in touch with the county extension office and talked to the agent. The agent listened to him and came out to his place and walked between the rows of these beautiful pecan trees with him. And then he asked the man a single question. He said, what did you plant as a pollinator? And the man kind of looked blank. He planted a single cultivar, but no companion variety, no cross-pollination. And the agent explained to him that pecans bear best when you have complementary types and they're not the same variety. Where you have a type 1 and a type 2. And that way pollen and timing will be a little different, but that's kind of what is the secret sauce to having a lot of pecans. He said without that in place, you can spend a decade, right, of honest work, and you'll get some beautiful trees, but they're never really going to bear pecans like you want. And the solution was simple but humbling. He didn't need to bulldoze the orchard or anything like that. He needed to align it with the maker's design. And so he grafted 2 of the existing trees and added 3 kind of compatible pollinators, and it wasn't instant, but within 2-3 years, the harvest changed, and the change was undeniable. He finally had all the pecans that he had been dreaming about for all of those years. He was able to just go crazy with his pecans, right? It was the same soil, the same sweat, the same kind of orchard, but it was finally aligned with the way God had designed pecans to bear fruit. So it was successful. And that's Psalm 90. We can spend our numbered days working hard, even producing things that look good from the outside, and still miss the harvest if we ignore the one who establishes it. So we need to live intentionally. We need to begin with his steadfast love and align with his work and ask him to give us labor that lasts. Give us a heart for eternity. Only then will the work of our hands be truly established when it aligns with his design and his purpose. In the 1700s, Jonathan Edwards was one of America's greatest preachers and thinkers. He's best known for a sermon called In the Hands of an Angry God, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He delivered it, and by all accounts, he wasn't a great preacher. He would hold stuff in front of his face and read it because he was very nearsighted. And yet, when he preached that sermon, people said they felt the flames of hell and smelled the smoke. And a lot of people point to that sermon as kind of a spark that got the Great Awakening really going. But when this guy was a teenager, he wrote out 70 life resolutions. And one of them read, resolved never to lose one moment of time, but improve it in the most profitable way I possibly can. And he had another that said, resolved that I will live so, as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. So he lived, starting as a teenager, with this sense that life was short, that it was brief, and he was going to number his days wisely. But he didn't stop there. His resolutions were not self-made goals. They were, dedications, consecrations to God. Again and again, he tied his commitments to the glory of the Lord. He prayed that God would satisfy him. He prayed that God would establish the work of his hands. And he died at 54 years of age. That's it. I used to think that was pretty old. Now I'm like, gosh, that's a tragedy. That's 2 years older than me. And some historians really credit him with the Great Awakening. That was a great revival that reshaped churches and communities for generations in our country. America shook under the preaching of a man who only lived 54 years because he numbered his days and lived intentionally before God. And that's the invitation of Psalm 90. Get a heart of wisdom. Number your days because they are few. Live your days intentionally because they are God's. And when you reach the end, maybe you won't look back and regret the time you wasted. But instead, you'll have joy, knowing that God has established the work of your hands and you did things that influence eternity. So don't drift into another season. Begin each morning praying, Lord, satisfy me with your love. And in each day asking, Lord, establish the work of my hands. Give me things to do that you want me to do. And when that last marble is gone, and you are going to run out someday, you may find that your days were not wasted, but established by the Lord.